Hey fans, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 9, Daf Tes of Masechta Sukkah. So, of course, Daf Tes has Amud Aleph and Amud Bet, like every Daf. Now, on Daf Tes Amud Aleph, there's a new Mishnah that discusses a Sukkah, and does it have to be built lishma? Does it have to be built with the intention of Sukkahs? Or if you just find a sukkah that was built for who knows what, but technically speaking, it's got all the requirements, maybe that's enough. And then Tesamud Beis is another Mishnah, and that talks about building a sukkah underneath a tree. So that is what we have on the agenda for today on Daf Tes of Masechta Sukkah. Here we go. We're beginning on Daf Tes all the way at the top of the page. New Mishnah, Sukkah Yeshana. If you have an old sukkah, that's basically code name for a sukkah that was built not with the intention of sukkahs. So meaning a sukkah yeshana, as Rashi says, if you built the sukkah more than 30 days in advance, more than 30 days before sukkahs, and you didn't have intention that you're building it for sukkahs, right? If it's within 30 days of sukkahs, so then if you're building a sukkah within 30 days of sukkahs, even if you don't have explicit intention that you're building it for sukkahs, mistama already, they're already talking about the halachas of sukkahs during those 30 days, right? Sholim v'darshim be'ilchos hachag, kol mechag shloshim yom. So they're already discussing sukkahs. So within 30 days, if you build a sukkah, mistama, it's for sukkahs and it's considered the shema. But prior to 30 days, if you don't explicitly have intention of building the sukkah for sukkahs, so then I don't know what you're building it for. But the assumption is that prior to 30 days, if you don't have explicit intention that you're building your sukkah for sukkahs, so then I don't know what you're building it for, but it's that we can't assume that it's for sukkahs. So now, therefore, what you have now is basically a structure that has all of the, the furnishings or whatever, I don't know, all the details, whatever it is, all the things requirements for a sukkah, right? As let's say, at least 2 tefach walls, it's got kosher schach, whatever it is, but it wasn't made for sukkahs. So Beishamai Postlin, Beishamai says that's a showstopper. That's not acceptable. Beisil Machshirin, Beisil says it's fine. Beisui Sukkah Yishana, what is an old sukkah? Kol she'asa kod mechag shloshim yom. If you made it prior to 30 days before sukkahs, and you didn't explicitly have intention that it's for sukkahs, so basically a stam sukkah, 30 days before sukkahs, that's what's called a sukkah yishana, an old sukkah, essentially a sukkah that was made without the intention of sukkahs. Aval yimasah l'shem chag afilu mitchilas hashana ksher. But if you made it with the intention of sukkahs, then even from the beginning of the year, and I suspect it means even before that, if you make a sukkah, I don't know. Anyways, it says that as long as you make the sukkah with the intention of sukkahs, then even more than 30 days beforehand, even from the beginning of the year, it would be considered okay. What about the beginning of the year before? Does that make a difference? I don't know. Does it have to be like for sukkahs this year? I don't know. But if you make a sukkah for sukkahs, it's kosher even if it's prior than 30 days. Fine. Zok the Gemara. My time of the Beishamai. How come Beishamai says that you have to build a sukkah with the intention of sukkahs? Omar Kra, well, the pasuk says Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yom LaHashem. Well, says Beishamai very simply. The pasuk says that Chag HaSukkos, the festival of Sukkot, Shivas Yom, is for 7 days LaHashem, for God. Sukkah Asuya L'Shem Chag. That you need that the sukkah is L'Shem. Right? I don't know exactly how they make the drasha. Maybe you could say kilu chag, which is like the shem, right? Chag. Then it says, right, chag ha-sukkah, so the sukkah and the chag la-Hashem. So kilu, the sukkah has to be the shem, chag. I think the main thing over here is the la-Hashem. It's like with the intention of whether it's Hashem or for the festival, but from the pasuk of chag ha-sukkah, shivas yom la-Hashem, sukkah asuya la-Shem, chag. That the sukkah needs to be made with the intention of the festival. If it's not made with the explicit intention of for the intention of the festival, so then it's possible. But fine, we need. Whereas Beis Hillel says, that pasuk of Chag HaSukkah Shivas Yom LaHashem, that does not teach us that a sukkah needs to be made with the intention of sukkahs. What it teaches us is like Rav Sheshes. The Rav Sheshes Mishum Rabbi Akiva, that Rav Sheshes says the name of Rabbi Akiva. Now it's interesting to me that Rav Sheshes would be saying the name of Rabbi Akiva. Obviously he's not quoting from Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva was way older than Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes was like a kind of, probably I'd say third generation Amora, whereas Rabbi Akiva was like, the second to last generation Tana, maybe even, third to last generation Tana. So clearly he wasn't quoting Rabbi Akiva directly, but he was saying the name of Rabbi Akiva, which is still interesting because of the generational difference. Meaning, we see sometimes that like Rabbi Yochanan says the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Not in the name. He's like from Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. That's already a closer generational thing. But I don't know, Rav Sheshes saying, Mishum Rabbi Akiva, what? Nobody else was quoting from Rabbi Akiva. We need Rav Sheshes, a third generation Amora, to be quoting a brisa from Rabbi Akiva. Then again, we learned in Masechta Eruvin that Rav Sheshes was one of those Amoraim who had great pekias. So maybe it was Davka a brisa that Rav Sheshes knew in his encyclopedic knowledge of brises that was not necessarily known by many other people. I don't know. Anyways, Rav Sheshes says the name of Rabbi Akiva Minayin Latzei Sukkah She'asuin Kol Shiva. How do you know that the wood that's used for the sukkah is off limits for the entire sukkahs? You leave them alone, you can't do anything else with them. Well, the pasuk says that the festival of Sukkot is 7 days for God, and therefore, any of the wood that you're using for the sukkah, leave them for all 7 days for God. Leave them, don't touch them. So it has nothing to do with a sukkah being lishma. It has to do with the fact that the wood of the sukkah you leave alone, you don't touch them, you don't use them the entire chag. V'tanya, we learn in the Brisa, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, Omer says Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, Kshem shechol shem shemayim al chagiga, kach chol shem shemayim al sukkah. Just like a korban chagiga, if you set aside an animal to be your shalmei chagiga, your korban shlomim that you bring on the festival. So just like that animal that you set aside for your shalmei chagiga is, kadosh, is like, Shem Shemaim is chal on it, it's hektish. So also Shem Shemaim is chal ala sukkah. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yom LaHashem. That the Chag HaSukkos, so Machag LaHashem, just like the Chagiga is LaHashem, Av Sukkah LaHashem. So also the Sukkah is for God, meaning it's off limits. That the wood of the Sukkah you can't use for 7 days. So we see that, so Beis Shammai wants to learn out from Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yom LaHashem that you have to build the Sukkah, L'Shem Sukkos. But Beis Hillel says no, from that pasuk we learn out that the wood of the Sukkah is off limits for all 7 days of Chag. In fact, the Gemara, Beis Shammai doesn't Beis Shammai also need this pasuk to teach us that the wood of the Sukkah is off limits for the entire Sukkahs? Enochinami. The Gemara says, yeah, you're right. Beis Shammai does need that pasuk to teach me that the wood of the sukkah is off limits for 7 days for the entire chag. So rather, okay, so then how do you know? How does Beis Shammai know that a sukkah has to be l'shma? That a sukkah has to be l'shem sukkahs? We have a different pasuk. Chag HaSukkos taiseloch. That you have to make the festival of Sukkot for you for 7 days. Sukkah asuya l'shem chag. Right, meaning the pasuk says Chag HaSukkos Taisa, so you kind of flip around the words a little bit. So instead of Chag HaSukkos Taisa, it's Sukkah Taisa l'Chag. Okay, you have to make the sukkah with the intention of sukkahs. Right, so Chag HaSukkos Taisa loch Shivas Yomim Sukkah asuya l'shem Chag ba'inun. We need a sukkah that was made for sukkahs. That is how Beis Shammai learns out that you have to build a sukkah with the intention of sukkahs. Whereas Beis Hillel learns out from that pasuk of Chag HaSukkos Taiselach Shivas Yomim that the fact that you can make a sukkah for all 7 days means that you're allowed to build a sukkah for all 7 days. Even on Chol HaMoed, you're allowed to construct a sukkah. Whereas Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Eliezer. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Rabbi Eliezer was associated with Beis Shammai. That Rabbi Eliezer says that you don't make a sukkah on Chol HaMoed. You cannot construct a sukkah on Chol HaMoed. And therefore, from the pasuk of Chag HaSukkos Taisel Chashivas Yomim, so Beis Shammai learns out from that pasuk that you have to build a sukkah with the intention of sukkahs. Beis Hillel learns out from that pasuk that Shivas Yom, for all 7 days, you're allowed to Chag HaSukkos Taisel. You can make a sukkah. You can construct a sukkah on any day of sukkahs for all 7 days, even on Chol HaMoed. Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Eliezer, says you cannot construct a sukkah on Chol HaMoed. And from that pasuk, they learn out that a sukkah has to be made with the intention of sukkahs. Okay, sounds very nice. Now 1 second. If Beis Hillel says that you do not need to construct a sukkah with the intention of sukkahs, well then maybe they would also not agree with what Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, which is Dam Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Asar min hakotzin u'min hanimin u'min hagradin psula. If you make tzitzis, right? Tzitzis, of course, you have like a garment with 4 corners. Then you have to sort of tie these strings to the corners. So let's say you made these tzitzis strings. So you didn't take a garment and then separately take strings and attach them to the corners and tie them for tzitzis. Rather, you actually found some extra threads on the garment itself, and you figured, Memela, I'll just use these threads as the tzitzis. Right? If you tie the tzitzis strings from extra threads that kind of were in the middle of the garment, that I guess the thread ended and they were kind of hanging off the garment, or from somehow if you sewed the garment somehow and then there were extra threads from that, or at the end of the weaving process there's extra slack at the end. If you use any of those sort of strings that were there memele, so then it's no good, because you need to tie the tzitzis with the intention of tzitzis. You can't just have strings that you found there memele. You have to actually make the tzitzis. You have to take the strings and apply them and tie them to the corners with the intention of I'm now tying tzitzis strings, not just that I found them, that they were left over from the weaving process attached to the garment. Psula minasisin ksher, but you can use a spool of wool, not a spool, a spool of thread, even though the threads weren't necessarily wound for the intention of tzitzis. You just kind of found a regular just spool of thread. You would be able to use that, even though those strings weren't specifically wound with the intention of winding tzitzis for strings for tzitzis. And then says Rav Yehuda that when I said this in front of Shmuel, he disagreed and said that no, even the strings, even the strings that you're going to use for tying the tzitzis, they have to be spun with the intention of tzitzis. You can't just use any thread and tie that for tzitzis. Okay, fine. Now there's a very interesting Rashi here that basically, right, so says Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav that, the tzitzis have to be made lishma. And then says Rav Yehuda, when I said this in front of Shmuel, Shmuel said that even the threads need to be spun lishma. And says Rashi that Rav Yehuda was a student of both Rav and of Shmuel. And that after Rav died, Rav Yehuda would often be quoting things that he learned from Rav in the name of Rav. And this is an example of something that he quoted in the name of Rav. And when he said it in front of Shmuel, something that he had learned from Rav, Shmuel disagreed. It's very interesting. I don't know if the implication of that Rashi is that Dafka, Rav Yehuda was originally a student of Rav, and then after he was a student of Rav, maybe then he moved over to Shmuel, and then he was saying something that he had learned when he was a student of Rav. Or maybe, I don't know, is it possible that he was a student of both simultaneously? I don't know. I guess maybe it makes sense that you have one Rebbe, so maybe he was first a student of Rav, and then he moved over to Shmuel, but very, very interesting nonetheless. So now the kasha is, so if it seems that both Rav and Shmuel are assuming that tzitzis needs to be made lishma, right? If you just have the threads, even Rav, who says that you're allowed to use regular string as tzitzis, he still says that if you found these like threads on the garment memela, you can't use them as tzitzis. You'd have to tie the tzitzis separately. So we see that the tzitzis have to be tied lishma, with the intention of the tzitzis. So therefore the shaila is, if Beis Hillel says that when it comes to sukkah, you do not need to construct the sukkah with the intention of sukkahs, what would they say regarding tzitzis? Do you have to tie the strings with the intention of tzitzis? So shiny awesome. So the Gemara answers it's different when it comes to tzitzis. Tzitzis, Beis Hillel would agree you have to do lishma. The Amar Krag dilim taiselach lach l'shem chovach. It says by tzitzis that you have to make these strings lach for you, lach l'shem chovach for you, for the intention of your obligation. So therefore, tzitzis have to be made lishma. There's no doubt about that. Hochanami chag hasukkos taiselecha l'cha l'shem chovcha. But one second, by sukkos also it says chag hasukkos taiselecha. You have to make for you. Shouldn't that also mean specifically for your obligation lishma? Haomi ba'ilei limute gzula. No, when it comes to sukkah, when it says chag hasukkos taiselecha, Beis Hillel would say that what that means is that it has to be yours. It can't be stolen. You can't use a stolen sukkah. It has to be your sukkah. But shouldn't you need that also? If you're saying that chag hasukkos taiselecha is to exclude a stolen sukkah, so shouldn't gedilim taiselach also exclude stolen tzitzis? Why are you saying that over there? It means that it has to be lishma, yet by sukkah it means to exclude a stolen sukkah. So we say no, but by tzitzis we have an additional pasuk. And it says, v'asulayim tzitzis, that they'll make for themselves a tzitzis that has to belong to them. And therefore, gedilim taiselach is free to learn out that it has to be lishma. By sukkis, all we have to work with is, what was the pasuk that we just quoted? Chag hasukkos taiselecha. That's the only pasuk we have to work with. And therefore, we need that pasuk to exclude a gezula if it's stolen. But we don't then have a source for making tzitzis, for making a sukkah with the intention specifically of sukkahs. Therefore, to reiterate, Beis Shammai says that a sukkah needs to be made with the intention of sukkahs. Beis Hillel says it does not need to be constructed with the intention of sukkahs. Okay, now turning the page to Daf Tes Amud Beis, we get to a new Mishnah. Ha'osa sukkaso tachso ilon. A fellow constructs a sukkah under a tree. Ki'ilu asa b'soch habayis. It's as though he made it inside of his house. Okay, we're going to learn out in the Gemara both that making a sukkah under a tree as well as making a sukkah inside of a house is a problem. Sukkah agabe sukkah, if you have one sukkah on top of another sukkah, a double-decker sukkah. Period. So the top sukkah is kosher, the bottom sukkah is pasul. Rabbi Yehuda says, well, if nobody's living in the top sukkah, well then the bottom sukkah is acceptable, and the Gemara is going to explain exactly what this means. Says the Gemara, Omer Rava, says Rava, says Rava, that when the Mishnah says that if you make a sukkah underneath a tree, that's a problem. It's only a problem if that tree is tzilas meruba mechamaso. If that tree, its shade is greater than its sun. But if there's more sun than shade on this tree, right, I guess the branches are relatively sparse, so then the sukkah remains ksher. Mimai, fact the Gemara, how come? Midiktani, from the fact that the pasuk says, Ki'ilu asa b'soch habayis. Did I say pasuk? I meant Mishnah. From the fact that the Mishnah says that if you make a sukkah under a tree, it doesn't say that if you make a sukkah under a tree, it's pasul. It doesn't say that. It says if you make a sukkah under a tree, it's as though you made it inside of a house. What's with the comparison to the house? B'soch habayis lo amali. How come the Mishnah needs to say it's as if you made it in the house? Just say it's possible. Lisnei psula. Elo hokamashmelon. The comparison to the house is to teach me the ilan dumi the bias that we need in order for the sukkah underneath the tree to be possible. We need the tree to be similar to a house. Just like a house, its roof has more shade, hopefully, than sun. Also, the tree that we're talking about is a tree whose shade is more than its sun. Perfect Gemara, 1 second. So, are we saying that if the tree has more sun than shade, then it's no problem? But still, I mean, if you have a tree above a sukkah, even if the branches are sort of sparse, nonetheless, those branches are connected to the tree, which makes them pasul schach, which means that above the sukkah is pasul schach. And therefore, you might have immediately on top of the sukkah, you're using kosher schach, but above that is pasul schach, and therefore contributing to the shade of the sukkah is pasul schach, these branches of the tree that are connected to the tree. And schach cannot be connected to a tree. Right? So, you have pasul schach now joining together with the kosher schach, creating a headache. Rav Papa says it's talking about where you were able to lower down the branches, even though they're still connected to the tree, but you were able to lower down the branches so that they're now together with the rest of the schach and interspersed with the rest of the schach. And since they are a minority of the rest of the schach, they become batal barov, right, nullified to the majority, and therefore they become a non-issue. But if it's talking about where he lowered down the branches and interspersed them with the rest of the schach, then what's the chiddush? We already know that if they're interspersed and mixed together with the rest of the schach, then they'll just be batal barov. What's the chiddush? So I may have thought to say, Nigzo eichan duchavton, atuhecha lo chavton. Well, I may have had to say, well, maybe even though in this particular case he may have lowered them down to be together with the rest of the schach and mix them together with the rest of the schach, and therefore it's batal barov, but maybe I would say that even in this case it would not be acceptable out of concern for a case where he doesn't mix them, lower down the branches and mix it together with the rest of the schach. Because if he just leaves them above the sukkah, it's a problem of the pasul schach. Because when the branches are separate from the rest of the schach, then they're their own entity, and they're schach pasul, and it makes a headache. Once you lower them down and mix them together with the rest of the schach, so then it becomes a mixture. And when it comes to a mixture, the schach pasul will be batal barov in the schach kosher. I might have a minute to say. I might think to say that even in a situation where you lower down the branches and mix them together with the rest of the schach, still it's a problem out of concern for a case where you did not mix them together with the rest of the schach and left them above the tree, above the sukkah. In which case they would not be mixed together with the rest of the schach, and they would be separate, and they would be schach pasul, which would create a headache. So I might think that even when you mix them together with the rest of the schach, it's a problem. Kamash malan dilo gazrinon. So therefore, what the chiddush is over here is that we don't make such a gezerah, and therefore, since he lowered down the branches of this tree and mixed them together with the rest of the schach, it's kosher because it's batal barov. Honami tonina, fact Gemara, but that also is a mishnah. Hidla aleas hagefen vesadlas. We're going to learn this mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, that if you take, let's say, grapevines, and they're attached to the ground, and you sling them over the top of the sukkah, you hang them over the sukkah, so now basically on top of your sukkah are grapevines that are attached to the ground, which are obviously pasul schach. Vesadlas, or gourds, which also kind of grow in these vines. Vesakisum, or ivy. v'sikich agabon psula, and you put schach on top of it, well then it's going to be possible because these vines that are attached to the ground are schach posel. However, if there's more kosher schach than there is this posel schach, or that he cut them from the ground, so they're no longer attached to the ground, so then it's kosher. Now, what's this talking about? If we're not talking about where they're mixed together all together, well then you have schach posel and schach kosher, and it creates a big mess. Rather, that Mishnah must be talking about where you took vines or ivy, things like that, and you mix them together with the rest of the schach, and we're saying that it's right that it's kosher because it's batal baro. So why do I need to learn over here by the tree that if I take the branches and I lower them down together with the rest of the schach, it's kosher? I already know that from the vines, that if they're still connected to the ground and you mix them together with the rest of the schach, as long as there's more schach kosher than there is vines which are schach posel, but as long as there's more schach kosher than there is schach posel, so then the schach posel becomes batal baro, and it's no problem. Well, I may have thought that to say that the Mishnah and Yud Aleph with the vines is only b'di'evet. B'lichatchila you would not be allowed to do this. Kamash Malan, from the tree, that you mamish, even lichatchila, you'd be allowed to take the branches of the tree, lower them down, mix them together, intersperse them together with the rest of the schach, and it is fine. Very interesting stuff. Going weiter in the Gemara, sukkah al gabe sukkah v'chule. So if you have a sukkah on top of another sukkah, it's a problem. Taner Rabbanan basukkahs teishvu v'lo b'sukkah shetachas sukkah. Okay, that's sit in a sukkah, but not in a sukkah that's on top of another sukkah, or that's beneath another sukkah. V'lo b'sukkah shetachas ilan, not a sukkah that's underneath a tree. V'lo b'sukkah shebesoch habayis, nor in a sukkah that's inside of the house. Adraba basukos tarti mashma, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak basukas ksiv, and we will finish with that. Basically, the point is that the word basukos in the pasuk, basukos teishvu, is actually written, as we learned the other day, right? Basukas, which is singular. And therefore, the point is that you have to be in a singular sukkah. Right? So let's read, the Brisa reads a little bit funny, so let's just read it and kind of massage it in. So Taner Rabbanan basukos teishvu, but it's really written basukas, which is singular. And therefore, when it says basukas teishvu, v'lo b'sukkah shetachas sukkah. So you have to sit in an individual sukkah, not a sukkah that's underneath another sukkah. V'lo b'sukkah shetachas ilan, not a sukkah that's underneath a tree, because then you have extra schach, kind of coming from above, which is a problem. V'lo b'sukkah shebesoch habayis, and not a sukkah that's inside of a house. You need a sukkah kind of standing on its own. So adrab basukos tarte mashma. So the Gemara says, yeah, but sukos is plural, no? So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak basukas ksiv, says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, yeah, but it's written basukas, which is singular, and therefore it means that you need a singular sukkah. That was daf tes of Masechta Sukkah. Let us do a shtickle review. So Testament Aleph discussed the sugya of sukkah l'shem chag. Do you need to build a sukkah with the intention of sukkah? Does it have to be built l'shem sukkah, l'shem chag? Beis says yes, it must. Beis Hillel says no, it does not need to be. That be'etzem is the discussion on Daf Testament Aleph. On Testament Beis, we discuss a sukkah that is under a tree, or a sukkah that's underneath another sukkah, or a sukkah that's in a house. We say that in all of these cases, it would be possible, because you need, as we learned at the end, basukas teishvu shivas yom, in a singular sukkah, not a sukkah that's underneath a tree or inside of a house or underneath another sukkah. Now, Rava says that when we say that a sukkah underneath a tree is a problem, that is specifically when the tree is tzilasam ruba me chamasa. However, if the tree is chamasam ruba mi tzilasa, so then it would be acceptable. But in order for it to be acceptable, you would need to lower down the branches and mix them together with the rest of the schach, so it would be batal barov. If you don't do that, well, then you have to be careful, because these branches are going to be schach posel, and as Rashi says, you would have to have enough schach kosher in that case, to be tzilasa muba mechamasa, because you have to be careful with these branches to make sure that they are not going to mess up the tzilasa muba mechamasa ratio. You definitely can't rely upon those branches for tzilasa muba mechamasa because they are pasul schach if they are not mixed together with the rest of the schach. That was the test of Masechta Sukkah. I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.